April 17th, 2020. I'm Shreen Vishmaya in India, welcoming you back to the P40 podcast with one of my favorite astrologers and beings and magical beings in this universe, Rick Levine. Thank you so much for meeting up with me today. We're kind of continuing a conversation we had yesterday. But I think a lot of what we were talking about yesterday would be great to bring back in. But maybe, many people know who you are, but if there's anything you'd like to share about, since we're all like living in the present moment, what's happening for you right here, right now?
Well, like so many people in the present moment, I am someone who almost always knows what's going on, and I am someone to whom people come when they don't know what's going on, both clients, friends, lovers, ex-wives, children, parents when they were around. I mean, I am a go-to person for what's happening. And right now, I don't have a fucking clue. I have no idea. I used to know what was going on. I mean, in broad strokes, I have a really good frame of reference for what's going on. And part of that frame of reference is the uniqueness of this moment is, we have entered the mythic proportion, each and every one of us. And the epicness of this moment is that no one knows what's going on. Even the people who are supposed to know, even the people who have, who are in control, if there's any such thing, even the people who have engineered this, if there's any such thing, even the people who have been prophesizing this and talking about this as an event for years. I mean, everyone from every different perspective has a take on what's going on, but now as it's unfolding, everyone's lost the plot. We've lost the plot. And that is at once a totally frightening moment, and it's the moment that has to occur prior to any enlightenment, liberation, or the beginning of any hero's journey, is the separation. I mean, and the separation here is a primal separation because we are, each and every one of us, separated from the truth. We all know that we're not being told everything, even though that can't be true and that can't be true. I know I believe that, but that's crazy, but you still don't believe any of it. Yeah. So that's, and as an astrologer, we can stand back and look at this and see this. And I mean, I could talk for 2 hours without repeating myself easily about the history of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction and opposition cycle. And we're in the midst of it. And we forget how potent that has been throughout our remembered history. I mean, from the crucifixion of Jesus to Muhammad taking Mecca and declaring it the state of Islam, to the Arab invasion of Spain, to the Catholic reconquering of Spain, to Black Death, in modern times, World War I, the freedom of India, and of course, we in the West think the romantic side of, Gandhi, winning the ultimate war against the British Empire without firing a shot. But somehow we forget, or we forgot to be taught, that 500,000 people were killed, over the border skirmishes between India and Pakistan. And of course, it's not lost on me that those border skirmishes are going on again right now, flourishing. And we look at the repetition of the Saturn-Pluto event as this. We in astrology know that if we only had 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 words to define Saturn, one of them would be boundary. One of them would be the absolute wall between what is and what isn't, or here and there, or fact and fiction, or life and death. Saturn is the finality of that wall. However, with the discovery and familiarity of becoming more involved with the invisible universe and the moving into the trans-Saturnian planets, of which Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were apparently just the first volley. I mean, NASA tracks 500,000 things going around the sun, and so the whole idea is here that Saturn is still, the greatest, of the great planets. It's the, Saturn is it. However, Saturn ain't what it used to be, because the line between physical and metaphysical has disintegrated. The line between death and rebirth, or between this realm and the mythic proportion, or this realm and the Bardo states, or however you want to frame it, that has disintegrated. When I was a kid, there were two forms of literature. There was fiction and nonfiction. Now, most of the things that I read are neither, or somewhere in between.
Yeah, right.
It's like there was no such things were either fiction or nonfiction.
Yeah.
And yet the entire realm of the unconscious and the material that's come up in the electromagnetic extension. When I say that, I'm talking about starting in the mid-19th century, as we began to extend. There's a good word. Extend and expand combined into extend. Okay. As we began to learn about the expanded electromagnetic spectrum, and we learned how to manipulate and use that to send information at the speed of light. I mean, you and I are here and now, but where is here and where is now? Because your now is the middle of my tomorrow, and my now is your last night. And where is here? Because here you are in my living room in Redmond, Washington, and for you, here is, up above the backwaters of Kerala, India. We're in different heres, and yet there's something that is. So where I'm going with this is that as we pushed beyond Saturn, where we live in a world where Bucky Fuller noted that 99% of all scientific research was occurring in areas of the universe that are not perceptible, that we can't perceive directly with our five senses. That's where the magic is. And of course, you're in India, in the Eastern, worlds, this is something that's not news to them, because they've lived in this world forever. But it's now in the West, this confrontation to that is overwhelming. So part of what we're experiencing, like every Saturn, Pluto, if Saturn is the limit and the boundary, Pluto is the disintegration of that boundary. It's the deconstruction, of what is real. In the truest sense, it's Nietzsche's real meaning of nihilism, not the Nazi interpretation. But nihilism is basically that which is the highest, that which is the most important. Those thoughts which are at the pinnacle of the mountain eventually deconstruct and fall to the bottom and need to be reconstructed. The phoenix arising from the ashes of the ruins of destruction. And of course, the operative words here are ashes, ruins, destruction. And so we are at a point where boundaries, Saturn, are being disintegrated, but instead of being disintegrated by a war or a new belief system, which is historically what we've dealt with as we track the Saturn Pluto backwards, the boundaries now are being disintegrated by some unknown zombie, because, viruses are not alive.
Yeah.
I find it humorous. Half the people in the world think that this pandemic is just a media myth and it's really nothing at all. And some of these people are crazy, and some of these people actually have good scientific justification for saying that this whole thing is being blown out of proportion, and the way we've blown it out of proportion is actually turning it into the event. And then we have the other half of the people in the world who say that this is the end of the world. So I've now, the story of Schrodinger's cat, in quantum physics, it used to be that things could be predicted and there were, one way or another. And without going into the experiment in great detail, Schrodinger won a Nobel Prize for basically coming up with laws of mathematics that basically said that if there's a 50-50 chance of some event happening, and that event actually causing the death of a cat that's used in his thought experiment, and we wouldn't know whether that cat was dead or alive, but in the old way of thinking, we would say, well, the cat's either dead or alive. It's a 50-50 chance of being dead and 50 chance being alive. But in quantum physics, because it's all based upon lack of causation and based upon probability, in the Schrodinger quantum way of saying it, is the cat is neither dead nor alive until the event is observed.
Right.
Once the event is observed, the quantum function is popped and reality then is observed. So this is, as far as I can consider, if I hear one more person saying something, this won't kill the virus or that won't kill the virus, you can't kill a virus because it's not alive.
Yeah.
There is no life function in a virus. It's just DNA or RNA, a long chain complex ribonucleic acid wrapped in a protein lipid shell, hard shell, and you can't kill it because it's never alive. So what we're experiencing, my dear friend, is Schrodinger's zombie apocalypse.
Wow.
We don't even know whether it's dead or alive, and we're being killed by zombies that have come back to life in us, and so this whole thing is we're living in a work of fiction, and half of me is absolutely fascinated and enjoying it and amazed that I get to live in this amazing moment, and the other half of me is like scared shit, like what the fuck is happening? I'm done. That's it.
Yeah. All right. It's like we're drowning in disinfectant and toilet paper. All this, everyone's getting bombarded. Yes. Well, yeah. Where do we go from here? I guess is the next question. Like, so what do you do when people come to you and ask you questions that are used to you having the answers? What are you saying? Are you this when you just?
I'm telling them that if anyone gives you an answer, get the hell out of there because they don't know, including me. I mean, I can certainly help you paint a perspective of this, but if I were you, I would not believe anything that I told you. In fact, I don't believe anything that I'm saying right now, not because I don't trust me, but because everything we believe is based upon our brain being fed down a reality tunnel that intellectually we knew was a reality tunnel, but now we know for sure because it's like the Truman Game movie. It's like this whole thing is a movie set that someone has pulled the rug out from under, and all of a sudden everyone's looking, holy smokes, that's not what I thought it was. That's not what I thought it was.
Well, and you and I were speaking yesterday about how this feels like, I was likening it to the judgment archetype in the tarot, the 20th major arcana, and that feeling of like we're coming out of this grave, like we're awakening, and it's almost like we're still in a body, but it's as if we've died and we're getting to do a judgment day survey. A lot of people have told me they've even been having this feeling about their life, like in their dreams, they're rehashing old memories in their dreams, like all the important events in their dreams, or even in their waking life, all this really deep nostalgia as if they've died. And they're doing this whole, retrospective review about what's happened to them up until now. And like, obviously some people are even thinking, what have we done to nature? Hopefully a lot of people are thinking this, but there's just this feeling, like this judgment day feeling. And you were likening it to your, all your interest when you were studying the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I thought that might be interesting to share.
Well, yeah, there's several ways to go here. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is, as I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners probably know, it obviously comes from the Tibetan Buddhist culture, and it ostensibly is a series of passages that are read to the deceased body that no longer carries the consciousness, but that becomes a focal point to bring the messages to the now disincarnated consciousness as it begins its journey into these realms of consciousness that do not have physicality attached to them. And the beginning of the Tibetan book, the probably bad English translation goes something like, "O nobly born, listen well. You are about to embark on a great and wondrous journey. The Rick Levine or the Shireen game is about to cease or has ceased. And you are now on this journey." Now the thing is that the Tibetan Book of the Dead in Tibetan is called Bardo Thodol. And Bardo, as many people know, is a Tibetan word that describes a state of consciousness without physicality attached to it. It's normally attributed to the states of consciousness between death and rebirth. Kind of what you were talking about earlier, the ghost realm of I've died, but I'm not reborn yet. The stage of, you know, the phoenix not broken out of the shell, the state of the butterfly after the caterpillar, but before the butterfly, that liminal in between kind of space.
Yes.
That's neither dead nor alive. We're back to Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah.
Now, so in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, though, the Bardo Thodol, Thodol is one of those interesting words that Tibetan has many of them that it takes about a paragraph to translate it. I mean, they have words that are, this word means liberation achieved through the visual sensing. Thodol means liberation or enlightenment that's achieved by recognition upon hearing. Now it's and so basically what you're voicing in the Tibetan Book of the Dead into the Bardo states a vibration that the consciousness can hear, but and become enlightened or freed, but they can't do that unless they've heard it before. Why do I say that? Because it's through recognition, and you can't recognize something unless you've already cognized it.
Right.
The time to get the teaching of how to sail a ship is not in the middle of the hurricane. This is the magic of any spiritual practice. This is the magic of yoga. This is the magic of, is like if you have the practice and then you find yourself in that spot and you don't know what to do, all it takes is one tiny voice that comes from a place either inside or from outside that says, "Rick, this is where you are, remember? Shit, I know exactly what to do. I've practiced this my whole life." Boom, and you go into motion. And the interesting thing about the Tibetan Book of the Dead is that when you read it to a spirit who has studied it in their life, then this frees them because they can get the message and not be confused by what's going on. Now, just to finish up this Bardo thing before we move on, although that'll be sitting in the background, is that my first inclination or first recognition, there's that recognize, my first cognition, you can't have a first, you have to have a cognition first. My first cognition that there was a thing called the Tibetan Book of the Dead was when I was a freshman in college in 1967. And this was I went to college at Stony Brook University outside of New York City. And for me, you know, like many people say, the 60s was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, for me, it was sex, drugs, rock and roll, and astrology. And that's where it all kind of came into some sort of like a stew pot. And one of the books that I came across very early on that year was a book called The Psychedelic Experience, a user's manual based upon the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And it was by Timothy Leary, co-authored by Timothy Leary, Dr. Richard Alpert, whom many people know as Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner, who was a teacher at California Institute of Integral Studies and just passed away just a year ago or so. and this book basically took the Tibetan Book of the Dead and basically repurposed it to help people understand and to move through the spaces that occur when one does a strong entheogenic substance that basically doesn't kill the body, it kills the ego. And the process of ego death and ego rebirth is actually not only the same as the process of physical death and physical rebirth, with the big distinction that you stay in the body, but it actually is a deeper teaching and meaning of the Tibetan book itself. In fact, the latest translation, popularization of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is by Rinpoche Lama Sogyal Rinpoche, and Lama Sogyal Rinpoche, sorry. And Sogyal Rinpoche basically titled his book or his work, The Tibetan Book of the Living and Dying.
Right.
Which kind of changes the perspective.
Yeah.
And I think I mentioned when we talked the other day that William Blake, who we both agreed was like, you know, he's like one of these Western mystics who actually got it.
Yes.
He was there. And he wanted on his gravestone as his epitaph, he wanted William Blake, born 1751, died many times since. You see, every time we die, even if it's a little death, you know, in orgasm, whether it's a merging with something where we have to go outside of our ego, drop the ego, and that can be done either in ecstasy, and stasis is a good Saturn word because it's about the boundary, and ecstasis means to go beyond Saturn, it's beyond stuff, it's beyond the stuff. And so when we have that ecstasis in sexuality, and it's not about the sexuality, it's about the intimacy where we merge ego. When we drop our ego, that is an ego death. By the same token, we can experience that when we're a kid and we go, I want chocolate ice cream for dessert, and mom says no. And we go into a temper tantrum and whatever, we've just experienced an ego death. We experience ego death and rebirth thousands of times through our lifetime, maybe hundreds of times a day. And yet when we begin to realize the pattern is always the same. And the pattern is a 3-step pattern where we have a death, which is boom, something happens. And at that moment, there's just the lightning strikes. We're at one with the lightning. The Buddhists call this the clear light of Buddha, the clear light. It basically is, there is no I to say, wow, I am feeling this. This is amazing, because there's no subject object. There's no I that can say I. All right. And anyone who's done any sort of meditation or spiritual work, not only in Buddhism, but in any of the Eastern traditions, practices, spiritualities, philosophy, psychologies, whatever you want to call them, understands that the I is not running the show. It's the illusion of I that runs the show. But when we drop that I for that moment, there's nothing. There's just one and the same. Everything. I am you as you are me, as we are all together. Goo goo gajoo. There is no. There's no boundary between you and me. And mystics and avatars live in that state where there is no boundary between themselves and the rest of the universe. It can be sustained, not by normal people, or not by every person.
Yes.
That is only sustained in most cases momentarily, because the next thing that begins to happen is that we get bombarded by sensibilia, sensory impressions, and they create this subject-object duality that is basically the second bardo, the second of the 3 stages. And in the second bardo, there's still not a connection, a groundedness. There's still no physicality, no body even. but in the second bardo, there's these wide swings of this, then that, and I hate you, Mom, I want my ice cream, and oh no, it's okay, and where's my boat, and where, I just, shit runs through our brain, and everything becomes the next distraction or fragmentation. And anyone who's read much of Hermann Hesse knows that many of his books focus on that second bardo,
Yeah.
where in Steppenwolf there's the magic theater. There's this idea that that all these things are going on, and whatever door we open, there's another aspect. Oh crap! And and of course, as I would imagine, Hess was a long time patient of Carl Jung's, and
Yeah.
so when we're reading Hess, we're actually reading a literary interpretation of one person's experience of Jungian analysis.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the magic of Hess.
Yeah.
And of course, he's a brilliant writer and a brilliant storyteller. But in the second bardo, there's always a subject and object differentiation, which happens in our lives, but in our lives, the subject-object differentiation is more solid because Saturn says, my subject is my physicality, and beyond that, I end. That's where the rest of the world is.
Mm-hmm.
But in the psyche, it's not like that at all. Now, at some point in time in that journey through this second bardo of collective unconscious, of myth, of archetype, which was, of course, Jung's playground, dreams, all of that, kind of gravitates back and forth between between the second bardo, and then at some point in time, there's this sense of longing, a sense of, I want a pizza. I remember Michael Luton once giving a lecture and talking about this, and saying that there I am floating around in the ethers, and all of a sudden it's, I want a pizza. It's all it takes is, and that becomes the hook.
Yeah.
It could be a longing for suckling at the breast. It could be the longing for a sexual experience, for someone in memory that you knew someplace, whatever, but it's a hook.
Yes,
and
yes.
at that hook, that begins the tumbling down in through the third and final bardo, which is the bardo of needs and wants and desires and frustration and sexuality and jealousy and envy and constriction. And now Saturn is making us smaller and smaller as we're being forced from this infinite dimension reality into the birth canal that is, I can't even breathe, and I'm kind of pushing on through, and then all of a sudden,
Yeah.
and I'm reborn, and there's no bardos, and here I am in physical being, and look, I have fingers and toes, and that starts all over again. So the magic of this, and we talked about this very briefly, is that although the natural process of this is death, first bardo, clear light, second bardo, subject-object differentiation, third bardo, sexuality and rebirth.
Yes.
The psychoanalytic movement that really began its origins in the late 19th century, when we had electromagnetism proliferating and we were being pushed into these invisible realms, and we had the rise of theosophy and animal magnetism. We had Mesmer and Charcot in Paris, this whole idea of what is the magic of the energy that's not physical. And Freud went to an exhibit in Paris, a demonstration from a French doctor, Charcot, I think Joseph Charcot, I think.
Yeah.
And it was on hypnotism, and it basically blew Freud's mind, and he went back to Vienna, and he was a lousy hypnotist, and he basically couldn't hypnotize people, but he saw what was there, and what was for him, the inkling of what needed to be brought out in these things that were considered to be dis-ease. The big ravaging disease at that time, was something that we call conversion hysteria. Yeah. And let's not lose the fact that hysteria comes from the Greek word hyster, which is for womb. And so technically hysteria was a woman's disease of having too many feelings, and they were converting them into "I can't hear you" or repetitious behavior. And so Freud, basically like a Taurus, said, "I'm going to figure this out." And he began to use dreams as a way. This is in the 1890s, actually at the height of the once every 500-year Neptune-Pluto conjunction cycle that was exact in the early 1890s. And you had the rise of mysticism and theosophy and Madame Blavatsky and the church, Christian Science, and so on.
Pluto, yes.
Yes. But Freud took a different tact, and he used Mercury, the psychopomp, the guider of souls back and forth between this realm and the hell realms. Mercury, the planet of talk, and he developed this thing that we now call talk therapy.
That's right.
All talk therapy comes from Freud. People can get down on Freud, politically incorrect, this, that, whatever. They don't have a clue as to what the full dynamic was, because what Freud did was almost like in a one-person kayak, he pushed against this force that was, he called it the id, the life force, that is partly the pleasure principle, but this energy, that's life energy that goes out. And he basically got in his little kayak and said, "I'm going to fight my way against this force to figure out where it's coming from." And I have this image of Freud, the Taurus, paddling up Niagara Falls in a one-person kayak, and people saying, "You can't do that. There's nothing there. It's just coming at it." And he's going, "No, I'm going to do this." And he paddles and paddles, and he digs deeper. And through his work of what we now call psychoanalysis, or the analysis of the psyche. I mean, remember, there wasn't even a word unconscious. I mean, words like projection and transference and resistance and I mean, these are all, and ego even was not used in that sense. These are all words that he coined to define what he saw as he got to the river that was like a big lake at the top of Niagara Falls. And he went, "Holy crap. This is where all that's coming from." And he created maps to help therapists figure out how to get people around in this territory so they could manage the water coming down the falls without it killing them.
Yes.
Now, of course, into the picture comes Jung, who never quite was the Freudian that some people would like to think, as opposed to some other key players in that whole tradition that really were Freudians and then broke. And I think of Wilhelm Reich or Wilhelm Reich as maybe the key person, because people talk a lot about the impact of the break between Freud and Jung. But although they both suffered from that break, people don't realize that Freud had handpicked Wilhelm Reich to be the inheritor of the Psychoanalytic Institute. He had basically created a mechanism, whereas he was his wunderkind and he was going to take over, until he started teaching. And right away, that wasn't going to work, because Reich took this whole thing is like almost a step further than Jung in a kind of crazy way, because Jung was very interested in going beyond Freud's third Bardo and pushed back into the second Bardo backwards, and came up with concepts that we now call the collective unconscious, or, the whole, what has become transpersonal psychology and archetypes and the whole hero's journey and Joseph Campbell, and all of that has kind of in a way come parallel form out of the rise of in the 20th century, is the confrontation with the unconscious, the invisible, the quantum reality. And you can kind of probably package all that up into Finnegan's Wake, but that's another story. And something that I discovered when I attacked Finnegan's Wake, probably about 10 or 12 years ago. And I say attacked, to me, it's like a life work of sorts. But what I learned, and most people don't know this, is that Joseph Campbell's first published book back in the early 30s was a book called A Skeleton Key to Understanding Finnegan's Wake.
I did not know.
And Finnegan's Wake is basically a deep dive into the unconscious. I mean, it's a book that is so unsaturnined, people, no one gets it. I mean, when I read it, and I read it often, I mean, I read a few pages and I feel like I just heard a Dylan song, that wasn't finished in his mescaline days or something. But I feel like I'm standing in front of a Jackson Pollock painting or listening to a Dylan song where it's, oh my God, this is amazing. I have no idea what it is. I don't know what just happened. I don't know who the characters are, but I know that this is important.
Yep.
So anyhow, but this whole deep dive into the unconscious, Finnegan's Wake, quantum physics, and Jung, and Wilhelm Reich basically took it a step further, because he said, no, we can actually reclaim the first Bardo. Wasn't his languaging. But Freud firmly believed that neurosis was a necessary byproduct of civilization. In his next to last book, Civilization and Its Discontent, I mean, he basically, and this was after Totem and Taboo, he makes a case for the more civilized we become, the more neurotic we'll become, the more therapy we will need, because we need to manage our neuroses.
Yeah.
And Reich said, bullshit. We can cure neuroses because, and one of Reich's first books, and this is very telling, was a book called, well, his two first books were The Psychology of Mass Fascism.
I love that book.
And The Function of the Orgasm.
Yeah,
and Reich basically said that Reich was reading Karl Marx while he was studying Sigmund Freud. And what he realized was that Marx hit a huge nail, but not quite on the head. And Reich said, the working class is not being suppressed economically, they're being suppressed sexually. And as long as they're brought into an environment where they can't own their sexuality, male and female with very different trajectories, but a similar result, that is the either unconscious repression or the conscious suppression, basically creates a weakened state where the mother, the father, the church, or the state can basically own control and have someone in submission. And so Reich became convinced that the only revolution that would change everything was a revolution where people became sexually woke. And in fact, he was kicked out of Germany for organizing factory workers and teaching them about sexuality. And before I leave that little topic, I have to come back to what I would consider a punchline here from our buddy William Blake,
yeah,
who in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell said, I have heard from the voice of hell that the earth will be destroyed at the end of 6,000 years. I've heard this from the voice of hell. At that time, the cherub will leave its guard at the tree of life, and all will be consumed and will become holy, whereas now it's finite and corrupt. Next line, key line. This shall come to pass by an improvement of sensual enjoyment. What? This shall come to pass by an improvement of sensual enjoyment. For if our doors of perception, meaning our sense organs, if our doors of perception were cleansed, then everything would appear as it is, infinite and holy. Now, it was that passage that Aldous Huxley used to title his two essays about his mescaline experiences, Marriage of Heaven and Hell. He wrote an essay called Heaven and Hell, and he wrote one called The Doors of Perception.
Right, okay.
Jim Morrison did an acid trip. Someone turned him on to Huxley. He then found William Blake, and he named his group The Doors.
Oh, I didn't even know that connection.
Absolutely true story. And when you look at their charts, Blake's and Morrison side by side, it's like this person's a reincarnation of, I mean, it's not quite that simple or linear, but their charts are crazy in the resonance that they have for one another.
Blake and Jim Morrison?
Yes.
I could see that. I've studied both of their charts. I had never made that connection. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, well, it's not an obvious thing because it has to do with a figure that I wouldn't say discovered, but I began exploring back 40 years ago based upon the five-pointed star, because most aspects in astrology are based upon divisions by 12. So we divide a circle by 1 and call it a conjunction, and 2 we call it an opposition, and 3 we call it a trine, and 4 we call it a square, and 6 we call it a sextile, and 12 we call it a semisextile or a quincunx. But we skip over the numbers that don't divide into 12 evenly. And it was the great mathematical genius Johannes Kepler who came up with this breakthrough that the planets are actually music, like Pythagoras had hypothesized, and that when you divide the cycle of a planet by 5, you come up with a quintile, which is a 5-pointed star. And he basically discovered the quintile and the biquintile and the half square and the square and a half. Those are all Keplerian introductions into astrology. But what's interesting is that the 5-pointed star, the quintile, is the only way to geometrically get to the golden mean, the divine proportion, which is the key to all the art and beauty and music and everything. I mean, the Da Vinci Code, the Fibonacci number series. The Fibonacci number series is basically gets closer and closer and closer to this magical number called phi, or the golden mean, or the divine proportion, the number that Kepler said was the ratio that God used to create like from like. Kepler's words, exact Kepler's words. And the way the Greeks who knew about them, and the Egyptians, I mean, the Great Pyramid in Giza, if you take a measurement from the top of the pyramid down to the base, right to the middle of the base, that's called the apothem in solid geometry. And if you divide the apothem by the distance from the base to a corner, that comes out to 1.61803 to some ridiculously accurate number. So the Great Pyramid was basically built on the ratio of the divine proportion. And of course, the stonemasons knew this. All the magical cathedrals in Europe are all built with the ratio of 1 to 1.6 or 1.62 or 1.6180339 ... The number can't be expressed in decimals, but it can be expressed geometrically exactly with a compass and a straight edge by making a 5-pointed star.
Wow.
Because when you make a 5-pointed star, every line on that 5-pointed star is intersected in 3 places, dividing the line into a short length and a long length.
Oh.
And the long length divided by the short length is exactly the same as the whole length divided by the long length, which is 1.61803 ... It is and the Greeks used the compass construction of a 5-pointed star to create these incredible places like the Parthenon, which is built on the golden mean. And the stonemasons built all the churches so that the windows and the doors and the rooms all had a 1 to 1.62 ratio. Now, what does this have to do with astrology and with everything else we're talking about? And it's crazy magical because the planets hum frequencies. They're not just rocks in space. Mm-hmm. And Venus hums at 224.5 Earth days to make one complete turn around the sun. Whereas the Earth takes 365 and a quarter, 2.24 days to go one complete time around the sun. Those who study astrology know this thing called the Venus star, which means that the Venus and Earth, from the sun's point of view, line up 5 times every 8 years. Those are Fibonacci numbers. 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 plus 1 equals 3, 3 plus 2, you keep adding the number behind, 3 plus 2 equals 5, 5 plus 3 equals 8. 5 and 8 are Fibonacci numbers. Venus makes 5 connections with Earth every 8 years, and they do it 72 degrees apart.
Wow.
And every 8 years, it comes back to within a degree of where it did it 8 years ago. So here's the crazy thing. You divide Earth 365 and a quarter by Venus 224.5 equals 1.62. Venus is the golden mean to Earth. What is the golden mean? The golden mean is beauty, it's love, it's aesthetic perfection. It's the ratio that made Da Vinci and Albrecht Dürer and the Renaissance artists, they were so enamored, they would work that ratio into the Mona Lisa Matter of fact, the opening scene to the Da Vinci Code, and Da Vinci was totally into the golden mean, but the Mona Lisa, her face is the, 1 to 1.6,
Yeah.
the eyes, the nose, the wit, everything in that.
Wow.
And so coming back round to this whole thing of the bardos and all of that is Venus is an interesting point. It's because Venus has a lot to do with where the ideal of perfection or beauty is manifest physically. Because Venus in Taurus is physical.
Yes.
Venus in Libra is intellectual or conceptual.
Right.
But here we are at a place where the boundary between physical and intellectual has disintegrated. It's like it's like the two are hard to tell apart. We have fake news. No one knows what's going on. No one knows what's going on because in the unconscious, everything is happening all at once.
There's no
Just
timeline.
pick your dream.
Yeah, there's no time.
Anyhow, I went on a crazy ramble, but that's what I do.
No, I love that you do that. It's like, what are those called? The great courses? You heard of that? Where people sign up and it's like you get to like have these amazing, you're like a great course, and you're like all the great courses in one talking to you. I feel like I just went back into like the best moments of my academic training, at the University of Michigan, like all my favorite moments, all when I was a philosophy student.
I love it.
Coming back together. Yeah, when I was in undergraduate, I had this degree called it's called general studies. People used to make fun of me for it, but I loved it because I could create whatever I wanted. And you were like, you were just like a survey of everything I was studying. It was like a mixture of all the philosophy and William Blake. It's great. So
yeah, Blake is one of, I have a whole lineage. Pythagoras and Kepler for sure, but and of course off on the side, there's cousin Rumi and Hafez, and that whole piece. And Lao Tzu and all of that stuff. Yeah. But in the West, certainly William Blake, and certainly Freud and Jung, and certainly Hess, and many other people. And Wilhelm Reich, just to continue that thought, is that Reich basically said, no, there's a way that we can actually integrate the fullness of the body, and we do not have to be neurotic to live in a society. The problem, of course, is how do you be sane in an insane society?
Yeah.
And here comes round the whole issue that that my buddy Bruce Lipton would refer to as epigenetics, and that is the genes are in some ways ultimately less important than the environment. A healthy organism becomes sick in a sick environment, and a sick organism becomes healthy in a healthy environment. And Reich was so far ahead of his time, as many of your listeners probably know. The FDA basically freaked out on him because he was curing incurable diseases with his metaphysical physical therapies, including cancer, bursitis, rheumatoid arthritis, diseases that were degenerative. And so the FDA busted him. They locked up all of his papers, for 50 years. And they tried him for, whatever the law is, practicing medical quackery. There's a real name for that. But he was tried as a quack physician. And, this guy was a, grand, aristocratic, German, what's the word I'm looking for? Very good and very arrogant in his knowledge. I think of Nietzsche, who once wrote, when one is speaking of something great, one must speak with humility and arrogance. And so Wilhelm Reich refused to testify in his trial because he said true science cannot be tried in a state court of law. And he went to jail and died. So here we are in a situation where the culture, in a way, is all of a sudden, for many people, and again, people are experiencing this on very different levels. Half the people are seeing that this is the moment of great awakening, and half of this people are seeing it that this is the moment in which medical science can triumph and prevent us all from dying. And until we triumph, it's basically You know, people are going to die by the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And so people are in very different realities around all of
Yeah,
this,
very different.
which is part of,
Yeah, very different realities.
which is part of the magic and part of the craziness.